Chapter 13. As I stood up, Lord Bane appeared to give Osric a glare. In one hand, he gripped the shaft of his favourite two-handed axe. "Come!" he snapped. Then he turned and walked off, axe held firmly, his sword dangling at his side. Osric got to his feet and went after his father, his head down, a miserable expression on his face. I followed my father to the high point of the ridge. Our frontline soldiers were already there. Hundreds and hundreds of men in two enormous long lines along the ridge, facing outwards. The two lines joined at the edges of the ridge so that they became one continuous line in a stretched circle shape, able to see the enemy coming from any direction. Their large wooden shields, decorated and painted, hung from their shoulders, ready to be brought up to the line for the famous shield wall. Massive space at the top of the ridge was already filling up as we reached the outer front line. And as we passed between the hardened, battle-scarred warriors of the front to join the rest of the army on the ridge, I felt an enormous sense of pride. I was no longer an onlooker. I was one of them, a warrior. I followed my father and we took our places high up on the ridge, close to where the king would stand, along with his brothers, Earls Gurth and Leofwine. Lord Bane and the other nobles had also arrived and were taking their places. The style of the battle would be that of the frontline soldiers, armed with spears and swords, who would form the shield wall, in which their shields were pressed together on the side so that they made a long and strong wooden defence. When the enemy attacked, they would come up against the wall and face spears being poked out from them through it. If any man on the front line was struck down, then the soldier behind him would take his place. The plan was for the enemy to wear themselves out, battering against the shield wall. The enemy would be at a disadvantage as they would be fighting uphill. When it was seen that the enemy showed signs of weakening, the wall would open slightly and our soldiers would pour out in different units and attack the enemy nearest fiercely, before withdrawing back inside the wall shelter. Once the enemy began to lose men, then we would go on the offensive. The shield wall would move forward and attack the enemy front lines, backed up by the soldiers behind them. The king, though, had taken my information about the Normans pretending to flee and then launched a counterattack, and that had given instructions to his commanders not to go in pursuit if the Normans suddenly fled, unless they were sure that the Norman retreat was real and not a ruse. Our army was broken down into sections based on where the men came from, which lord's estate and who was the master. The men of my father's estate had a wolf's head on their shields and followed the shouted commands of my father's steward, Ulrich, who was further down on the ridge from where my father and I stood. Other men from our estate and my father's section of our army were in the main body of the soldiers, and they would give an echo and shouted commands that Ulrich gave. Although I had seen from earlier battles I had observed that once the battle was in full cry, there was little chance of hearing any shouted command. So great was the sound of metal on metal and yells and screams of the soldiers. For that reason, major actions, trumpets would be blown to order the soldiers to forward or to retreat. The trumpeters were spread throughout the ranks of the soldiers and at high points of the ridge. The enclosure inside the shield wall was now thicker, men close to one another but making room around them so that they could unsheath their swords for action. "I can't see," I whispered to my father, angry at being so small to be able to see our enemy approaching. All I could see was tall men towering over me. "I can see well enough for the both of us," replied my father. "I will let you know what happens." There was a movement of the men standing beside me, and through the crowd I saw that the king himself had arrived with his closest earls. Their group moved past and took up their positions at the highest point of the ridge, just above us. We were in place. The sun was now slowly gaining height, rising in the sky. The Norman soldiers had said their attack would come at first light. No, it was first light now. Where were the Normans? And then I heard in the far distance the sound of trumpets, followed by an echo from our own trumpets on the ridge. "I see them," I said to my father. "The Normans are coming."